I'm Manjul. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about human origins, specifically thinking about ancient DNA and what we've learned from it. And I have a background in genetics. My background's in medical genetics. I did a PhD focusing on, inherited cancer risk, inherited neurodevelopmental risk. But I developed an interest during this time in population genetics, ancient DNA as well, largely because I read this book by a famous or eminent paleogeneticist named David Reich. He wrote this book in 2018 called Who We Are and How We Got Here, and that's really kind of burst into the mainstream, the field of ancient DNA. And so we had talked about this in some of our private conversations, and I thought you found this very interesting. And so you wanted to ask some questions about that today, and I think we can just jump in there and just start shooting questions at me.
I did indeed find that conversation very interesting, and I think our listeners would as well. Unlike your background, my background is basically asking simple questions of experts and trying to be a jack of all trades. So here goes. As we understand, as the common person understands of human origin, even I knew or I had heard that all humans started out of Africa, and then all today here we are. So how did that happen? How did humans origin out of Africa? And so if all of us, you, me, who look different, talk different, eat different, all originated from one place, how come we all look different today in terms, and what makes us different? And could you establish some timelines so that we all can get started on this topic?
Certainly. Obviously, this is a question that I think comes to everyone's mind. And to some extent, we all get a little bit of education on this in school, but unfortunately not enough. Of course, some of this is because we're learning so many new things every day. And so you really kind of had two questions there. The first one was essentially, where do humans come from? And the second one is, why is there so much diversity? Where does it come from, given that we all start in the same place? And so the first one, we did all originate in Africa in terms of our broad human lineage. And what I mean by that is, there were other types of humans that preceded us. And the kind of general term that we use for these people are archaic humans. And that includes, we kind of avoid the term species, but it includes species like Homo erectus and Homo naledi and all these other different types of skeletal remains that we found that look human but don't look very much like us and are from an older time period, to put it simply. So if we go back 1 million years, 2 million years, there are these human-like or human organisms that are living in Africa. And, we don't know a lot about these besides some of the remains that we have because we don't have DNA from them, because DNA doesn't last a super long time in the African environment. So there were these archaic human groups in Africa going back 1 to 2 million years. And some of these groups left Africa and populated the Eurasian continent. And this goes back a long time. The current estimate is around 1.8 million years that groups like Homo erectus had left Africa and got swept up through Eurasia. And again, because that's really far back, a little bit too far back for recovering ancient DNA from these remains, we don't have great insight to exactly, what was going on, what these groups were like. So there's a little bit of mystery. But then getting closer to our time, 300,000 years, we start seeing evidence of modern human beings. And so there's the fossilized remains that were found in Morocco in 2017. And it's a skull and some of the skeleton of what looks to be a modern human being. We still don't know a lot about what's going on during this time from a genetic perspective, but closer, if we fast forward another 200,000 years to between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, we have a lot of great evidence that people that look like us today had swept up through Africa and the Near East into the Eurasian continent, and that this is essentially the final seeding of the Eurasian continent that has led to modern human beings. And that's a little bit of a simplification, of course, because there's more to the story, but that's where modern humans got to Eurasia out of Africa. And so that's what we call the out of Africa hypothesis. And that's the dominant model that we've had for a long time. and it's only recently being complicated by ancient DNA evidence. Now, it's important to remember that our origins are still in Africa in terms of like the original emergence of humans from whatever the prior lineage was, which was, something that looked a little bit more ape-like, didn't necessarily walk on 2 feet and have some of our more distinctive features. But in terms of modern humans having modern behavior, we think that is around this 300,000 time period, 300,000 years ago, and that we finally populate, the major continents around 50,000 years ago, and we start seeing a lot of evidence of representational culture, evidence of the fact that they had modern language around this time.
So am I to understand that about 300,000 some years ago, all humans essentially looked the same and had similar genetic composition?
Yeah, so it's hard to speculate exactly about the level of human diversity back then, but compared to to know exactly what was going on. But what we do know is that compared to today, there was actually more human diversity in the past, right? So if you go back 300,000 years, we know that there was more than just our lineage. There was a bunch of archaic human groups, so other human groups like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and many of these other groups that existed that have essentially gone totally extinct. And there's only us that now remains. And so we're the last of these many varied human lineages that if you roll back 300,000 years or a million years ago, there were many other groups that were out there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So sounds like no trust fund and guy in finance, but it seemed like it was easier 300,000 some years ago to find a 6'5" guy with blue eyes.
So actually, I mean, I don't. It's hard to know exactly what some of the traits were. I don't think that they were. I mean, Homo erectus were supposedly a little bit taller than modern humans, although Homo erectus had smaller brain spaces. So it's hard to speculate exactly on what the traits were back then.
Gotcha. So still Wall Street might be the better luck for those looking for that, rather than time traveling 300,000 some years ago.
Yes. But what is true, you raise a good point in terms of the fact that it was easier to find a great deal more human diversity at that time. And there seemed to be environmental conditions that were encouraging basically lots of brain growth. So there's a lot of basically parallel selection for growing big brains, which probably means that calories were plentiful. Life was a little bit easy in some respects, for some of these old ancient groups of humans. And we don't know exactly why that today we're the only ones left, but a lot of that diversity was basically subtracted away. And we have the remnants from some of these old groups. Specifically, we know a lot about how Neanderthals have contributed to our lineage, but we don't know a lot about what else was happening. We just know that some of it was happening.
So are you saying then that those of us that are here today, and we can break it down, I guess racially is the best way to do it for our purposes. At the core, we are more similar than different when considering to the past in terms of like taking away all sociocultural aspects away, like from a gene and calling human wise, we are all one species today.
Yes, from a genetic perspective, we are what we usually refer to a young species, and we have a limited set of genetic diversity, even though we see like a lot of physical diversity in the world. And so a lot of the physical diversity that we see has been essentially caused by natural selection that is due to local environments. And so one of the prominent ones, of course, being skin pigmentation or just pigmentation in general. We know that, groups that had left Africa and moved to higher latitudes, there was eventually natural selection for lighter skin and lighter eyes, which was related to the amount of sun exposure they were essentially getting in those regions. And those that lived closer to the equator, they had selection for darker skin and darker pigmentation generally. And, there's a lot of great science that has explored selection on pigmentation. And that's really explained by a few genes, actually. And so most human traits are complex, and there's hundreds, thousands, many thousands of genes that contribute to those traits. And it's a little bit harder to understand how natural selection may have worked on those complex human traits.
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is that, the human diversity we see has all came from a relatively small population of
Yeah.
founding humans. Yeah.
Okay.
And there was some input from old humans, like I've mentioned Neanderthals. Some Neanderthals had especially intermixed with some non-Africans. And we don't exactly know where, but in the Near East or somewhere in Eurasia. And that signature of Neanderthals still exists in many non-Africans today. Now, there's also some Neanderthal contribution to Africans as well. So there's probably some migration back to Africa after that intermixing with
Gotcha.
Neanderthals.
What are some of those signatures of Neanderthals? Like, would you say the Viking
So
people, anything along those lines, or is that not appropriate to say?
I think that's like a common misunderstanding is I don't think there's a lot of contribution to physical traits from Neanderthals that are out there. I think there's some evidence that Neanderthal DNA has contributed somewhat to immune system traits in human beings, but not necessarily in physical traits. And that's because actually the lab of David Reich has been able to show that there is actually natural selection against the DNA of Neanderthals that exists in human beings. So when Neanderthals and modern humans intermixed initially, a lot of the male offspring of those mixes were much less fertile than the women or just like modern humans alone or just 100% Neanderthals.
So we talked about the migration that over time looks like natural selection, leading to certain species like converging on, again, very basic genetic basis, like converging in one species of humans, convergence towards one species of humans.
Mhm.
So, like, what caused this movement 300,000 some years ago that people would want to migrate? Was it scarcity of resources? Were there weather related issues? And would they move in herds? And at what point, like, were there family creation or sects of the group? And what size are we talking here? What was the total population of the world, I guess, at that point, would you say?
Mhm. Yeah, so all really great questions. Tackling the migration one. And so, by the study of ancient DNA, we've really learned that there's this natural propensity among human groups to move all over the place. And the exact reason why they're doing this is not entirely clear at every moment in history. Those are very specific questions, but a lot of the reasons why a lot of these human groups are moving have to do with either access to calories. So a lot of hunter-gatherer groups, they're following big game around wherever it may be moving because they don't have a sedentary lifestyle where they have a source of food already set up. They have to go where the food is. And there's also over these big swaths of time that we're talking about, the weather, the climate changed significantly. We're talking about ice ages during this period of time, major changes in climate. And so there were human groups that were affected by these changes in climate and they had to move different places because again they aren't protected from climate in the way that humans are today with our modern technology. And even then we still in a lot of ways are sensitive to changes in what's going on in the environment. So again, humans, they like to move. The other thing too about hunter gatherers that we know about them is that they had kind of wider ranges even when they were living in sort of a specific region. It wasn't just like, we stay in our little 100-yard area. They're ranging quite a bit. And in terms of how many, what was the census of ancient humans at any one period of time, it's very difficult to know. Again, it's going to depend on the time you're talking about. But when we think about that, the natural environment, social environment that people were living in, these were groups of like 100 to 200 people. There's this number from an anthropologist named Robin Dunbar called the Dunbar number, which is like the estimate of the maximum number of people that you can have a close relationship with. And it's been replicated a number of ways. They'll like look at the behavior of small firms and they'll show that you get increasingly efficient up to like a certain size. And then after a certain size, things start breaking down communication wise. So it's essentially there's a limit on how big these hunter gatherer groups could be. And so we put it kind of around that number. And it wasn't until you get, modern agriculture and all the cultural developments that go along with it in terms of developing cities that we start breaking out of the Dunbar number. So in terms of what do the family arrangements look like in a hunter-gatherer society, I think there's quite a bit of variation. I don't necessarily think it looks like the modern traditional family of today. There were probably different arrangements. I mean, we can see a little bit different arrangements among the hunter gatherers that still exist today, like in Africa or other places in the world. That you see different things. Sometimes it's a monogamous pair, sometimes it's a polygynous arrangement, sometimes it's like different and they don't necessarily even know who the father is of the child. Sometimes they call it like a shared paternity approach is used. So there's these different things, and I bet during these times that we saw a lot of it, but it's very likely that over the course of human evolution, we see increasing investment in parenting from between the mother and the child. And we also see over the same time, probably increasing investment from the fathers as well. And there's probably some selection on this. It's thought that over history that fathers increasingly became invested in the rearing of children because the women that they were having children with were interested in choosing mates that were going to be good fathers. So it's what we call sexually selected for. This is one theory. There's obviously different ideas about this, and nothing's proven. And I forget what else you may ask, but we covered migration and the size and what the family structures may be there. But
No, yeah, that was pretty
wherever
much
that
it.
takes us.
So, as this was evolving, I'm assuming the culture and language was also coming along. So, how did that happen? How did early humans develop language? What impact did it have on social structures? And how do we know what we know about all of these things that we're talking about today?
The evolution of language is this huge subject in the evolution of humans. It's hotly debated. There's a lot of different theories, but based on what we know, or the theory that I prefer, is that we saw a lot of little incremental and gradual changes on essentially some existing predicate, so that whatever the intermediate species between more ape-like animals and then more human-like animals, there was probably already a little bit of a substrate that was existing there. And then many, many little changes over time drove the full flowering of complex language. And I think this process probably continued even into our modern lineage a little bit. There's actually some really interesting evidence that modern humans had more verbal facility than Neanderthals. And this comes from looking at different methylation patterns on the genomes of Neanderthals versus the genomes of humans. And they show that these differential patterns between these two different human groups suggest that there's been some selection on the soft tissue of the voice box in modern humans that has changed. There's also this very famous gene that was suggested as very important in the evolution of language called FOXP2. And FOXP2 is a transcription factor gene, which means it binds DNA and controls the expression of genes. And what was shown by the study of FOXP2 gene is that it's largely unchanged between over millions of years of evolution, like going from essentially rodent species like mice through early, ape species like in chimps. And there's essentially no changes between that time and that gene. It's the same between these groups. But in the human lineage, we see two significant changes, as in two different mutations that occur in FOXP2, that is all in the human lineage. And so we think those are very important for language. One of the reasons why we think that too is that we know today there's sometimes people who have disease-causing mutations, or what we call pathogenic mutations in the gene of FOXP2, that makes the product of the gene non-functional. And those people, while cognitively normal, can't communicate, can't receive language in the same way that everyone else can. And so that suggests that it's very important to language. Another piece of evidence too is that they've taken the human version of FOXP2 and they put it in mice. And when they put the human FOXP2 in mice, the mice that have it squeak differently than other regular mice. And so it really suggests that FOXP2 is doing something to complexify our verbal abilities. What exactly it is, it's not known. There's also an interesting difference too in FOXP2 between Neanderthals and humans as well. So there's two pieces of evidence that suggest that our language abilities were far in excess, or maybe perhaps better than other Neanderthals. Though it's also likely that Neanderthals spoke in some way. More evidence that there was likely some pre-existing substrate for language. And this doesn't quite answer, like why language? Why did language itself come about? And so there's any number of theories for this, but two ideas that I like a lot are one, that our ape predecessors were what we call frugivores, right? So they ate fruit, but they ate fruit before it fell from the trees. And so this required social coordination among groups of these, of our ape ancestors. So that's one reason they needed ways to communicate. Obviously, if you fast forward a little bit too, there's a big need to communicate when hunting as well, right? So that there needs to be communication between different hunters when they're hunting. Like you're hunting in a group, some giant mammoth, right? You're probably not doing that alone.
Yeah. So do you think like the first everyone's head was in the same page in a way, so to say, that everyone was thinking the same and someone just did a random gesture? Like, is it a spark one time? I'm assuming it's more gradual, but like, did
Yes.
one ape certainly one day start making a certain kind of sound, and then everyone else copied, and from next time on, that was the thing they did when they like? Is that how it happened? How does it happen? Like that moment, the eureka moment, or like, okay, this guy meant that, and so like from now I understand, kind of thing. Or is it much slower to be thought in that line of chain of thought? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's really hard to think about because I don't think it occurs like over one generation. I think it's these little modifications over many generations, and it probably happens in fits and starts. So like there was a little bit, one group got really good at language, and then another group got really good at language slowly over time, over many generations. And so it was like, I think little tweaks.
But not
And
thousands of years. You're still saying over hundreds of years, maybe, but not thousands.
no, over the timeline, I think we're talking about to get from like basically proto speech. A lot of animals, they can make noises, they can make
Yeah.
gestural noises essentially. So to get from a place where like there's an ancestor with gestural noises to the fact where you have full blown declarative language with complex syntax, I think we're talking millions of years of evolution, not just thousands.
Okay.
But then within humans, to say go from maybe a very basic language, like very simple stuff, to like full sentences, I don't know. It could have been really fast, and it could be really slow. I don't know.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Quick
So,
digression, I guess. Is it our genetic? Because animals clearly existed then, and I don't know if there's been any proof or any research on whether animals talk to each other.
there is.
Like maybe they do up to a certain degree, but maybe not as advanced as humans do. And I'm assuming that's because of the genetic makeup of humans that makes us, like, our brains are more complex and more capable.
The big difference between us and say a lot of other animal species is that the size of our brains relative to our bodies is astronomically, or is significantly different. Even take, for example, chimpanzees. Our brains are essentially 3 times larger, correctly, for body size than a chimpanzee's. And so there was essentially, we know this based on, sampling the archaeological record, that there was this basically almost linear increase in brain volume over 2.5-3 million years. And so during this time is also probably the time when language complexity, language capabilities were emerging in our lineage. And
what about elephants and others? Like, are our brains bigger than elephants' brain?
Relative to our bodies, yes. Not like
I see. It's a proportion of the body. Gotcha.
It's a proportion. It's a proportional thing. Obviously, when you think about elephants, they need to be able to feel and move all their limbs, and they have this giant body, so you end up with more tissue. But relative to their body size, it's not the same. So it's essentially, you can think of like how efficient is the.
Are human the highest in that ratio?
Yes.
And who's next? Like dolphins?
I think it's like, it's like that, or like octopus. something like that. Yeah.
Which, for our listeners, your octopus reminded me quick.
Mhm.
TV show recommendation, My Octopus Teacher.
There you go.
I could help explain that octopuses maybe do have more ability than maybe one would think without a common person would think. Very
Yes.
good documentary. I enjoyed. Maybe we
Yeah.
should do more of these, give people recommendations on
Yeah.
shows,
Totally.
videos, or anything we've watched, that even if it's remotely relevant to what we're talking about.
Agreed.
Okay, that all makes sense. So now bringing it to modern world and all, like I'm assuming at first people thought, and this still exists today, like as more and more people went away, people had sense of localization, as in me, my family, my relatives, my community, then my blah blah blah. Of course, modern country lines, and this comes much later history. So how do we go from that, like taking care of, like you just said, needed to communicate to achieve something together as a community, to where we are today, and what's the relevance of all this work?
So, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking essentially how do we move from sort of a tribal hunter gatherer, very subsistence level existence to essentially modern lifestyles, like big city. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, yeah, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And so, we
And I
don't
know there's we
exact.
studied in schools about civilizations and all. So in this civilization, I remember from school, and we
Yeah.
talked about various other civilization. I'm assuming that's the intermediate step between that
Yes.
to today.
Yeah, so an important milestone here that when we think about human evolution is the invention of agriculture. And so the invention of agriculture again comes in a fits and starts sort of way, and it happens in different places. This is wild too. The agriculture was invented by different human groups separately around the same time. So it kind of is this like essentially something that was predetermined by material factors at the time? That's some speculation, but that could be. And so agriculture emerges, and that changes a lot about how humans organize themselves. They start settling in one spot, and it changes the social arrangements as well. Hierarchy becomes more important, becomes more relevant to the organization of a society, and you start getting more children as well. And from early agriculture societies and to get to like fully modern world economies, there's any number of ways that this happens, but it's essentially thought that the reason we go in a linear way with increasing complexity is we start getting written language. And when you start getting written language, all the knowledge that one generation has gets to start building generation after generation after generation. And you're getting basically returns of scale because the effective knowledge of the population that you're working with is increasing, 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 increasing.
Yeah,
And there's all this research too that will show that like if you increase the size of a network, you'll be able to do more things or it'll have more knowledge and so on. And that's
yeah,
essentially the process that is going on with humans. And it just
yeah.
occurs over this after we get agriculture to modern days. And it's not like a linear process. For instance, during the Bronze Age, say like roughly 3,000 years ago, there was a world economy. That's kind of crazy. We had a world economy 3,000 years ago, but that world economy collapsed entirely, and we don't exactly know why it collapsed. It's called late Bronze Age collapse among archaeologists. And the reason there was a world economy is because they were making bronze, and bronze required that you took tin and copper, which had sources in different places, and they had to be brought together. So you needed a world economy.
That's
So
very interesting. I do remember
yeah,
the importance of publishing or the printers from the book Noise and Signal, where it talks
yeah,
about how mistakes could be corrected, and
mm-hmm.
because in the old written world sometimes those would be in the perpetuated versus corrected and all that. And yeah, what you say there is, I think, really important, that new generations didn't have to reinvent or relearn everything and lose some from word of mouth and all. In fact, tying it to Kathmandu and Nepal, after the earthquake, recent 2015-16 earthquake, a lot of older generations build those temples, very beautiful ornate temples. They had learned from previous generations, but I don't know if there's as much documentation or even interest from newer generations to want to learn those craftsmanship from their grandfathers. So had that earthquake happened, say, a decade later, I don't know if there would be many people around to be even construct it or rebuild it to their previous state, and we would have lost some things forever. So
Yeah.
like just tying the past to the present in the sense in terms of one of the, I guess, on the margins and negatives of modernization or westernization, is as we call it in the East, is that people don't have the same regard for their history and their past or even languages. And while in terms of convenience and all, it's I guess good modernization, but at the same time, so many languages are at risk of being lost. And in fact, I forget, was it New York Times or Wall Street Journal had a big article on how there's more languages spoken in Queens in New York, um, that like if certain of those residents were to die, those languages would be lost. So that's very interesting, of 300,000 years of 1,000 years of work being so close to being lost. And I hope efforts are being taken to preserve those history and relevance of that. So moving on to, I guess, more contemporary relevance related topics, I guess, as a researcher, as a scientist, if God were to appear in front of you and say, I can answer one question about the past with scientific accuracy to you, what is one question you would like concrete answer to?
Yeah, so on this subject, I think the biggest question we want to know is really how do we get modern human behavior from a biological perspective? So what were the selection pressures that got us from archaic human forms? A lot of these other archaic human forms could, wield fire and could cook and things like that. But what gets us over the hump in terms of getting us to complex language, representational culture, all the great things that we can do with our brains today, it's still a huge mystery. We don't know what these different selection pressures were. We have this one thread with FOXP2 in language, which is, of course, nowhere near the full story. We want to know what were all these important adaptations that got us to modern human level sophistication that allowed us to do what we've done over the course of history, which was essentially conquer the world, develop an amazing complexity, potentially on the brink of birthing true artificial intelligence, potentially today.
Yeah.
So we want to know, going back into this deep essential black hole of time, what were these changes? Because right now we don't know. There's some people that think, oh, it was a few small, really important major changes that occurred, but we can't find any evidence of this. Based on what we know about human complex traits and human evolution, we think it's many small changes over a little bit of longer period of time. Is a more gradual, slow process, but we still want to know all these things. Now, fortunately, we do have a little bit of a hint on this because we have the Neanderthal genome. We can compare us to the Neanderthals and start seeing how we're different. That's not going to answer all the questions that we have, but it's going to tell us a little bit about some of the things that maybe differentiates modern humans from Neanderthals. And that's obviously a slow going project because we have to investigate all these different little differences.
Yeah. So you said it was a slow growing process. So with the advancement in technology such as AI, machine learning, and I'm assuming cost of sequencing and others have also come down.
Mm-hmm.
Do you expect the next decade or so to have a like much faster acceleration in our understanding of this, or do you think the easiest thing, the lowest hanging fruits have already been answered and found, and so like the next truth or depth of understanding is increasingly harder to obtain going forward?
Yeah, returning to David Reich's book, I think that was a sign that the field had reached some level of maturity, right? I also should mention Svante Pabo, this scientist at the Max Planck Institute. He won a Nobel Prize for developing methods that allowed for the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome because they had this thumb bone from a cave in Siberia, and they were able to get ancient DNA from Neanderthals there and have it of a sufficient purity in order to sequence it. So there's been a lot of recent development in terms of the methods that allow us to obtain ancient DNA samples and then make sure that they're contamination free and then do the sequencing in a cost effective way and also at an industrial scale. So those developments were all super important. And now those are accomplished, along with a suite of statistical approaches that allow us to ask questions about ancient human mixing events and ancient human migrations. And so those have really made the field of the study of ancient DNA pretty mature. But I still expect us to see a lot of growth in our knowledge as we get more and more ancient human DNA samples. The extent to which these totally rewrite the insights we have today is yet to be determined. So the insights could be huge, they could be small. And again, getting more samples from Africa will be really instrumental in terms of answering a lot of important questions about deep human history. And so hopefully we can get those. Also, being able to apply techniques other than DNA sequencing to still get molecular insights. We have organic remains essentially that may not really have any usable DNA, but maybe they have usable proteins that we can study. And so we can study the proteins maybe and learn something that way. So there's all these things that can happen. I think there can be many contributions from different technologies. I think it'll be many different things, but yes, tool development will be really important, and I do expect us to learn a lot of cool things in the coming future. I think we see some maturity in the field, and there may be some plateauing in some spaces, but I think we can still expect exciting things in this space.
What about from other fields? Like, how have discoveries, say, in archaeology or any other related fields, helped or contradicted what have been found in your field of study?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I'm not like in the field of ancient DNA, but if we put it broadly, genetics, yes. So I think what genetics has contributed is that it's been able to either disconfirm or confirm certain narratives that have been spun up from archaeologists, right? So you need to have the remains. The archaeologists need to do the digs, and that's a really laborious. It's a really arduous. They're going like millimeter by millimeter by millimeter in these dig areas and like cataloging everything possible, and doing this. It's very formalized, very professionalized now. It's very intensive, and so it's very important work. But I think there is a little bit of a limit in terms of like there's obviously good measure of ascertainment bias that goes on when we're dealing with what are we able to dig out of the ground. But when you look at DNA in a genome, it's not just a snapshot of the person. It's also a look into the person's past. That's what's incredible because of the features of how reproduction works, how you get a genome from your mom and a genome from your dad, which are combinations of their mom and dad, and the genome is not just static, it's modular. So different parts of the mom and dad's genomes from the past and their mom and dad's genomes of the past have mixed, and we know the rate at which they mix. So we are able to use this information to look back at information from their ancestors, right? So when we have our genomes and we can look at our genomes and compare those to the past, and we can get ancient genomes and compare those genomes to the past and also to the present. So that information is extremely important, and it's a really important complement to archaeology. And I think the modern field of archaeology today is really excited to leverage what can be learned from DNA. And so there's like a merging of the fields, or what we would call consilience is the jargony word for it. That's going on now because of the advancements in ancient DNA sequencing, and then what archaeology wants to bring to that field.
Gotcha. Okay, that's I think we covered a fair amount from beginnings in Africa, the need to constantly move because the food source moved. So following that, then over time discovering agriculture, forming societies, need for coordination, as you did that, need for hierarchy, then civilizations as you settle in one place. And then slowly to today's modern humans is my understanding of all of this certainly took a step forward. Of course, as always, there's more questions than answers sometimes as we dig deeper. Anything else you think is relevant that we should have talked about or we should touch upon before we wrap this episode up?
I was surprised you didn't ask about the Sherpas
Oh,
and
of
how
course,
they.
sure, yeah. So like even to this day, right? Like, and it's important you bring this up. Nepal, where I'm from, is the size of Ohio in a way, but I've never seen more geographical, but as well as diversity within such a small place. There's multiple languages spoken. and you can go from mango growing region to snow-capped mountains within 3-4 hours of drive. That is due to poor infrastructure, given the actual hardship in constructing that infrastructure. The elevation just picks up in a very small distance, right?
Right.
And to this day, we see, and if you have watched any, some again good documentary recommendations coming up today with me, 14 Peaks in Netflix, as well as Mountain Queen, which is a new one, talks about
Okay.
the Sherpa people of Nepal who traditionally made a living being porters for Westerners who wanted to climb Everest, still do. So clearly, within that small region, like a country as small as Nepal, there's that kind of difference between people in the place where some have acclimated over years to high altitude and could ascend like some of the world's tallest mountains without oxygen even, and I
Mhm.
certainly couldn't do that. I grew up in Kathmandu, the valley, and they look different, but at our core, we're Nepali. We share certain same traditions but difference. How do you explain that? When do you think, like, again, like, put some time frame, or like, do you think in the history of whatever we talked about, their lineage would be different than mine, even though we are belong to the same country today, a small country at that?
Yes. So I think broadly, ancestry stories that you and the Sherpas of Nepal share is pretty similar. It's just that they have adapt. There's been adaptation among the populations that live at high altitudes in that place. So the adaptation happened once the region was settled, and so the differences between the populations that live at lower elevation versus higher elevation have only just recently diverged. I don't exactly know the exact time scale, but it's fairly recent. And I don't know if the mutation that was selected for is entirely new in those people or had already existed previously and was just enriched. I think probably the latter case is more likely. But there's this paper in a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that was done on the Sherpa population. And they looked at evidence of local natural selection on the Sherpa people. And what they found is perhaps there was a change in a gene called PAR alpha. And that change allows them to have more efficient metabolisms concerning, related to oxygen. So they're just better at using oxygen, which oxygen is essential in generating energy in your body, of course, than populations nearby that live at lower altitudes, right? And so I think there's a few different types in the human population of altitude adaptation. And so there may be other types of altitude adaptation happening in the Sherpa as well. There probably is to some extent, but this is one place in the genome that they know is different in the Sherpa population because of their local environment.
Gotcha.
And so
So let me be
they
silly
are.
a little bit, right? Let's say a
Uh,
big joint family that lives in what is called the Tarai, which is the tropical, hotter side of Nepal, says, you
mhm,
know what? I really like the attributes they have developed. I want my future generations to have that. Let us all move to the higher altitude and
mhm.
like try to over years like do this weird experiment where over years we're gonna develop and become like that.
Yeah.
What do you think would happen if someone were to try to do this? What, as I say out loud, it sounds stupid, I understand,
No.
but do this
Yeah.
experiment where, like, I don't know, like 20 families which trace like maybe
Uh,
same generations, like same great great grandfathers, like move up to a different region and say we're gonna live and try to be different and see what happens. Like, what do you think
yeah.
happened? Would they die off, or like would, like, how many years would it take for them to start being different than the original family that moved?
So the time it takes is going to depend on the selection pressure. And what's going to happen probably is that someone from the Sherpa population is going to intermix. They're going to mate with someone from the non Sherpa population. It's going to pass on that adaptation trait. And that trait is going to be selected for in the subsequent generations of the family. Now, how long it takes to get enriched is going to, again, depend on how strong the selection pressure is. If they can live at the high altitudes and it's hard for them, but they can still live and have children and everything, and they don't necessarily mix with the Sherpa population. There may be no selection, there may be no evolution on that trait at all.
So it would just be difficult breathing the whole time, or
It could be. I mean, obviously, your body can acclimate some on its own, right? Like even between if you fly to Denver from somewhere
yeah,
else in America, like at
yeah,
first it's like you're huffing and puffing, but
yeah.
eventually you acclimate, right?
So when that
So
acclimatation, that adaptation happens, that's not changing any code or any genome of yours. That's like other
correct.
aspects of body
Yep.
adapting, but not the code in itself changing.
Correct. That's your physiology. That's
Yeah,
your body changes to meet the demands of the environment. Now, you
gotcha,
can't pass that on to your child. Your child has to go through the same process when they enter the
gotcha.
world or they change their elevation.
And if there's no
But,
intermixing with the local who has changed genome, that
yep,
process, future generation just has to keep doing that. So at no
yep.
point you would think then like that
Yeah. And
people would like genetically change. And maybe that's another topic we didn't touch about is like how inbreeding used to be a thing in the
mhm.
past, and maybe
Well,
people
so,
figured
yeah.
out that that is bad for life in general, and then they started not doing that.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. But essentially, yeah, you're right in terms of like people who are too similar genetically having children together is oftentimes deleterious. You get what we call recessive diseases, right? So they may carry mutation in one of their genes, but you have two copies of each gene from your mom and your dad, and so you can have one copy of the mutation and be okay. But if you have children with someone who's closely related to you and also has the same mutation as you, your child has then a 50% chance of inheriting both together, and then they're what we call a natural human knockout at a given gene, and they don't have that functional gene anymore, and then they usually have some sort of disease, whether it's like an inborn error in metabolism or some neurodevelopmental condition or a heart condition. It could be really anything. There's all types of autosomal recessive diseases. So that's one
Gotcha. So it
example.
looks
And
like we can just conclude the episode by saying, marry a foreigner.
yeah, so I mean, it is thought that a lot of times that more diversity in your genome, essentially more heterozygous regions versus homozygous regions, it may be more adaptive. But yeah, so it depends on your environment too. So it's
Gotcha.
but that's the thing. We can wrap up around the fact that there's an amazing amount of human diversity. We're still all one species. We're all one population ultimately with a shared history. Evolution has worked its magic over time in different places at different times. There are some differences, and those are really interesting to study and find out.
Yeah,
And so,
sounds like you remove change species with Americans and you could run for president with the same speech. We're all Americans, we celebrate our diversity, and we are all in all the same.
yes, yes, indeed,
But,
indeed.
all right, very cool. So hopefully everyone had learned something from this. Definitely reach out with what more questions or what you thought was interesting.
Cool. Thank you. See you guys.